In the very early hours of September 2nd, 1666, the smell in the air above Pudding Lane was warm bread gone wrong. It was the smell of a hearth that had not been properly banked before sleep. Familiar enough, almost domestic, the kind of smell that a baker's household might register even in dreams without fully waking. The fire that would eventually consume a third of the city of London was, in those first minutes, small enough that a man standing on the opposite side of the lane might have mistaken it for a lantern left burning too close to a beam. London, in that summer, was dry, in a way that the city had not been dry for years. The timber-framed buildings along Pudding Lane and the lanes beside it had not seen significant rain in weeks. The upper stories of the buildings projected out over the streets below, in some places narrowing the sky to a thin strip of dark, and between opposing windows, the gap was close enough that neighbors could pass things hand to hand without descending to the street. The fire moved into this architecture the way a tongue moves into a space it has found. Quietly at first, following the grain of the wood, following the pitch in the roof seams, following the dry September air that moved steadily off the river and up through the lanes toward the city's interior. What the fire moved through was not simply timber and thatch. The parishes of the city closest to the river had been, in the preceding year, among the most severely affected districts during the outbreak of bubonic plague that ran from 1665 into 1666, and the tenements that stood closest together, the densest, most airless, most overcrowded, had been precisely the structures where infection moved most readily between households. The parish registers from 1665 recorded deaths in numbers that the clerks who maintained them had not encountered in living memory, approximately 68,596 in total across the city and its liberties, and the buildings along the lanes south of Cheapside had produced some of the highest concentrations of that figure. By September of 1666, the fire had no way of knowing this. Fire does not calculate. It takes what is dry and what is close, and it continues. The Great Fire burned for 4 days. It consumed approximately 373 acres of the city, along with 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and the original St. Paul's Cathedral. These are the numbers that appeared in subsequent surveys and that have continued to appear in accounts of the fire ever since. What is less frequently noted, but what epidemiologists and historians of disease have returned to with interest in the centuries since, is that the fire moved through the densest zones of plague infection with a thoroughness that no planned intervention of the period could have matched. The rats, the fleas, the infected material in the buildings, the physical substrate through which the disease had passed and continued to pass, burned. In the 18 months following the fire, bubonic plague did not return to the city in the way that the patterns of the preceding decades had consistently suggested it would. The connection between these two facts is not perfectly direct and has been contested by scholars, but it is genuine enough to have remained in the historical record as something worth examining rather than dismissing. The fire began as a mistake, or at least as a negligence. A hearth in a bakery on Pudding Lane left insufficiently attended before the household went to sleep. No one planned for it to be a sanitary measure. No one planned for it to move through the city's plague districts in the particular pattern that it did. The fire did not know what it was doing. That is, in some ways, exactly the point. There is a quality that belongs to certain kinds of historical accidents, in which what looks from one angle like a catastrophe reveals, when turned over, a different surface entirely. Not a compensation, not a designed silver lining, but something more accidental than that. The fire that forgot what damage it was doing, and in forgetting, did something that no one had asked it to do. On the flat, river-threaded land outside the city of Leyden, in the autumn of 1574, the Spanish army of the Duke of Alba had maintained a siege of the city through most of the year, and the Dutch defenders had been considering a desperate measure, flooding the polderland that surrounded the city by opening the sea sluices and allowing the water in. The plan required careful calculation. The polderland outside Leyden was extraordinarily flat, managed by a network of dikes and sluice gates that held the sea at bay, and to flood it in a controlled way, enough to impede the Spanish tercio columns without drowning everything beyond recovery, required precise knowledge of water levels and drainage patterns and the timing of tides. The sluice operators who carried out the flooding in October of 1574 did not apparently achieve this precision. The water that moved across the polderland moved at a different rate and in a different distribution than the planners had calculated. In some areas, it moved faster than expected. In some areas, it spread sideways into corridors that had not been included in the defensive plan. The Spanish approach routes to the city were inundated, as intended, but the flooding also reached land that had not been specified. Low roads and field margins and approach paths that ran between Leyden and the smaller farming villages in the corridor to the north and east. The Spanish tercio was one of the dominant military formations of the 16th century, disciplined, experienced, and accustomed to moving through difficult terrain. What it could not move through in the flatlands outside Leyden in October of 1574 was water that had spread further than anyone expected it to. The columns that had planned their approach routes across the polderland found those routes simply gone, not blocked, not defended, but absent, replaced by a shallow expanse of cold water that reflected the flat gray sky of a Dutch October and offered nowhere solid to stand. Leyden was relieved. The city survived. The smaller farming villages along the corridors where the flooding had spread further than planned also survived. These settlements, their names appearing in Dutch provincial records and in the later chronicles of the 80 Years' War, had not been specifically included in the defensive calculations. They had not been prioritized, had not been protected by design, had occupied no particular strategic role in the thinking of the Dutch commanders. They were simply there in the land that the misread flooding orders had submerged, and the Spanish forces never reached them. The mistake had drawn the water further than intended, and in doing so had quietly extended a protection that the plan had not thought to provide. The water in the polderland moved slowly. It moved at night, in the October dark, spreading between rows of rye stubble that stood in the flooded fields like the remains of something already finished, filling the low roads that Spanish soldiers had planned to march along at dawn. The water did not rush. It rose by centimeters and found the lowest paths and followed them, the way all water does, and in doing so it made the land briefly into something the army could not read or cross. By the time the morning came, the roads were gone. In a scriptorium in England, sometime during the decades after 1066, and continuing well into the medieval centuries, the administrative apparatus of the English state produced its records through the hands of chancery clerks, men who copied names and figures from one parchment to another, who maintained the rolls that recorded feudal obligations, taxable wealth, military service owed to the crown. These clerks worked by candlelight, often under pressure to produce documents quickly, copying columns of names in hands that were sometimes clear and sometimes compressed by fatigue or the poor quality of a quill. Errors entered the record in ordinary ways. A letter doubled, a syllable dropped, a name transcribed from one column into the wrong row of a neighboring one. During the compilation of a subsidy roll in the 13th century, a chancery clerk copying the village records of a Lincolnshire community wrote something slightly wrong. The exact nature of the error, whether a letter was transposed, a word omitted, a name shifted out of its proper column, is the kind of detail that the surviving documents preserve, only in consequence rather than directly. What the record shows, or rather what it fails to show, is the expected entry for that community's military obligations. The village's men were not summoned for the Welsh campaign of 1282 to 1283. Edward I's Welsh campaigns were conducted at considerable human cost to the English communities that contributed to them. Villages of comparable size to the Lincolnshire settlement in question lost, according to the records of neighboring parishes, between a quarter and a third of their fighting-age men, some to combat, some to the diseases that moved through campaign armies with even more efficiency than the armies themselves moved through the land. The surviving records of the communities that did send their men to Wales carry this loss in the gaps they leave. Households recorded as intact in one assessment, recorded as diminished or gone in the next. The Lincolnshire village carried no such gap. A clerk had written one name slightly wrong, and a community had moved quietly through a war that its neighbors endured, its households remaining where they were, its fields continuing in the same hands from season to season. The clerk at the candlelit desk where this happened would not have known. The error, if it was noticed at all, would have appeared as a minor administrative irregularity of the kind that accumulated in any complex record-keeping system operating under pressure. There would have been no reason to examine it more closely. The moment in which it happened, a quill dipping into ink, a column of names being copied, one name written slightly differently from the parchment being copied from, lasted perhaps 2 or 3 seconds. The consequence of it lasted for the lifetimes of every person in that village, and for the lifetimes of their children who were born to fathers who had remained at home. In the autumn of 1870, the Prussian armies moving through the Lorraine region of northeastern France were operating from maps. The maps had been produced with considerable effort and distributed to staff officers, but the campaign had moved faster than the map makers had anticipated, and the reproductions circulated to field units were not always consistent with one another. The grid coordinates on hastily reproduced staff maps sometimes disagreed with the originals from which they had been copied, and a unit moving by map rather than by direct observation of known landmarks could, in certain condition, find itself outside the operational zone its orders had assigned to it without being certain which document to trust. A Prussian infantry column operating in the Lorraine region received orders to withdraw from a village it had already entered. The orders arrived because the erroneous grid coordinates on the column's staff map had placed the unit outside its designated operational zone. The map said the unit was somewhere it was not, and the orders based on that map required the unit to correct its position accordingly. The column withdrew. The village whose church spire was just visible through the trees behind the departing column was a civilian settlement. The village had nothing particular to distinguish it from the other settlements along the same road. It had no strategic significance, no military installation, no resources that a military force would have reason to prioritize over neighboring settlements of similar size. What it had was proximity to the column's incorrectly recorded position, and when the column was ordered to withdraw, the village was simply left behind. The Franco-Prussian War produced a pattern of forced requisitioning in the villages along military routes, soldiers billeted in private homes, food and fodder taken from local stores, the ordinary disruptions that accompany any armed force moving through settled land. The records from the Lorraine campaign document this pattern in the settlements along the correctly traveled routes. The village from which the column withdrew did not appear in those records as a site of requisitioning. It appeared in the administrative documents of the period as something that the war had passed beside rather than through, like a stone that the river moved around, leaving it where it was. The officers who conferred by lantern light over the folded map on the muddy road at dusk, reading the coordinates and comparing them to the orders in hand, were solving an administrative problem. The village behind them, visible as a dark shape and a church spire through the October trees, was simply a detail of the landscape as they understood it. Their decision to turn back the way they came was a military decision made on military grounds, based on a map that was wrong. The village remained dark and undisturbed as the sounds of the column faded down the road away from it, the lantern light moving with them, the trees closing back over the quiet they had briefly interrupted. On a hillside above the Apennine town of Gesso in 1880, a team of surveyors was doing the careful, meticulous work of measuring elevation. The work required precision instruments, reference points established on the ground, and the systematic recording of numbers in field notebooks that would later be compiled into a formal report. The report would determine the feasibility of routing a railway through this part of the Apennine landscape, and the railway, if approved, would bring with it the full consequence of 19th century industrial development. Workers, infrastructure, the particular transformation of a place that comes with the laying of tracks and the building of stations and the steady compression of travel time between one place and another. The numbers the surveying team recorded were slightly wrong. Elevation data submitted for the proposed route through the Gesso corridor placed the gradient outside the parameters that the Railway Commission required. The Commission reviewed the report and concluded that the route was not technically feasible. The railway was directed elsewhere. The surveyors packed their instruments into their cases and descended the hillside, their notebooks closed, their work finished. Below them, the town of Gesso continued in the way that towns in the Apennines had continued for centuries, built into the landscape at an angle that suited the terrain rather than the engineering requirements of modern infrastructure. Its streets and buildings, oriented to the logic of the hillside rather than to the logic of the valley floor that a railway would have required. The town had no particular reason to mark the departure of the survey team. The survey team had done its work. The numbers were in the notebooks. 13 years later, in 1893, a major landslide struck the original planned railway corridor. The force and volume of the debris flow that moved through that valley section in 1893 was the kind of geological event that the landscape had been preparing for over a long period of accumulating instability. The railways of the period and the development patterns they generated, the settlements that clustered along rail lines, the workers' housing, the expanded commercial activity, concentrated people, and infrastructure in exactly the corridors that the natural movement of the land, periodically and violently reclaimed. The Gesso corridor had no railway. There was no workers' housing, no station, no expansion of settlement along the road. The tracks would have followed. The infrastructure that would have been destroyed was not there to be destroyed. The casualties that railway-driven development would have concentrated in that corridor were not there to be counted. The town of Gesso, higher on the hillside and separated from the planned route by the gradient that the wrong elevation numbers had made the engineers consider impassable, was not directly in the path of what moved through the valley in 8. The surveyors who recorded the wrong numbers in 1880 had no knowledge of the landslide that would occur 13 years later. The geological processes that produced the 1893 event were already in motion in 1880, built into the structure of the hillside, as invisible to the survey team as they were to everyone else who walked or worked or traveled through that landscape in the years between the survey and the slide. The numbers that went into the notebooks were the result of ordinary survey conditions, instruments, reference points, the accumulated small decisions of a working day on a hillside in the Apennines. The wrong data was probably not the result of a single dramatic error, but of the ordinary accumulation of small inaccuracies that any field measurement gathers, and that usually, when examined against independent reference points, get corrected before they reach a final report. These numbers were not corrected. They moved from the notebooks into the report, and from the report into the Commission's decision, and from the Commission's decision into the absence of a railway, and from the absence of a railway into the presence of the town exactly as it had been, on its hillside, going about its life without particular reference to what had happened in a government office when someone had looked at the gradient figures and decided the route was impractical. There is something in this sequence that resists being made into a neat story about good fortune or providential design. The sequence is too slow, too distributed, too entirely indifferent to its own consequences to carry the weight of intention. The survey team was doing its job. The Commission was doing its job. The railway was redirected for technical reasons by people who had no knowledge of what the hillside would do in 1893. The residents of Gesso were living their lives without any particular awareness that they had been quietly exempted from a future they would never know to miss. The hillside in autumn, after the surveying team had gone, was simply a hillside. The grass on the planned railway corridor was dry and short, as it would remain. The stone of the slope sat in its ordinary arrangement, the kind of arrangement that looks entirely stable to anyone who does not know what patience a landscape requires. The town below was doing what the town below always did at that hour, settling into the cooler air of the afternoon, smoke beginning to come from the chimneys of the lower district, a cart moving on the main street, a dog somewhere on a step. The slope above it held, in its wrong numbers and its absence of tracks, a future that had simply not arrived. The planned route down through the valley, the one that would have carried steel rails and sleepers and the whole apparatus of a 19th century rail line, was now just a slope of dry grass and pale stone running down from the survey team's last measuring point toward the valley floor. No marker distinguished it from any other section of hillside. No sign indicated that something had been planned there and then unmade. The gradient sat at the angle it had always held, slightly steeper than the engineers had believed they could accommodate, steeper in the notebooks than it was in reality, which is to say that it was exactly what it had always been, unchanged by the numbers that had described it incorrectly, and unchanged by the decision those numbers had produced. In the valley below where the railway corridor had been intended to run, the autumn light moved across the land in the way it always did at this hour, low and slightly golden, catching the pale stones of the path and the dry grass that grew between them, the shadows of the hillside beginning to extend eastward as the afternoon shifted toward evening. The town above the valley floor sat in its usual position, its buildings arranged in the pattern they had occupied for generations, its streets worn smooth by the feet of people who had never needed to accommodate a train station or a workers' settlement, or the particular kind of change that a railway brings to a place when it arrives. This was not salvation in any dramatic sense. The town had not been rescued from something it had known was coming. It had simply continued. Its routines and its seasonal patterns and its particular arrangement of stone and slope and light, while somewhere in a government office, a number written slightly wrong had redirected the future down a different valley. The event was complete and finished by the time anyone could have recognized it as an event at all. The surveying team's notebooks, with their slightly wrong elevation figures, had gone wherever government documents went, into the archive of the commission, into whatever storage the railway authority maintained for the records of feasibility studies that had resulted in rejections. The hillside above Gesso had gone back to being a hillside, unmarked by anything that had happened on it in 1880 except the faint disturbance of footprints that had already been erased by the following season's grass. The town below continued, in the way that towns continue when nothing particular has been decided about them, which is to say that it continued in the same direction it had always been going, neither faster nor slower than the pace its own history had set. The path that would have been a railway corridor was now simply a slope. By the time of the landslide in 1893, it was as indistinguishable from the rest of the hillside as it had been in 1879, before the survey team arrived. The grass on it was the same dry, short grass that grew on either side. The stone beneath was the same pale Apennine stone. The light that crossed it in the afternoons moved in the same direction it had always moved, from west to east, across a surface that had held nothing and would hold nothing that the survey had not already prevented. The town below was still there. Its streets were still in the arrangement that its founders had given them. Its buildings still faced the directions they had always faced. The gradient of the hillside above it was still slightly wrong in the only document that had ever formally measured it, and the wrongness of that measurement had settled into the landscape so quietly, over so many years, that by the time anyone might have thought to examine it, the thing the measurement had prevented had long since been prevented, and the thing it had preserved was simply there, on its hillside, in the afternoon light, in the still and open way that a future looks when it has simply been allowed to continue without being redirected. In a room at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1961, a computer the size of a wardrobe hums against one wall. The hum is low and continuous, the kind of sound that fills a space so completely that after a few minutes the ear stops registering it as sound at all and begins to experience it simply as the room's particular quality of silence. Edward Lorenz is sitting at a desk beside it, and the room smells of warm electronics and the faint chemical sharpness of printer ink. He is rerunning a weather simulation he has already run once, and he is doing it the quick way, not from the beginning of the stored data, but from the midpoint, reading a number off the paper strip the machine had printed out earlier and typing it in by hand so that the computation can start from where it left off rather than from the very beginning, which would take too long. The number on the paper strip reads 0, 506. The value the machine had stored and used the first time was 0, 5, 0, 6, 1, 2, 7. The difference between these two numbers is smaller than 1/10 of 1%. It is the kind of difference that would not register in almost any practical context, in a recipe, in a measurement of distance, in a count of objects in a room. Lorenz typed the shorter number in, set the simulation running, and left the room. When he came back, the printed output was waiting for him on the roll, and the weather the simulation had produced looked nothing like the weather it had produced before. Not a slight variation, not a minor drift at the margins. The two runs had been identical, up to a point, and then they had separated the way two paths separate, in a field after a fork, and by the time the simulation had run for the equivalent of 2 months of weather, they described entirely different states of the atmosphere, different pressures, different temperatures, different movements of air across the map. The machine had not made an error. Lorenz had simply given it a slightly different starting condition, and the mathematics had done exactly what mathematics does, which is follow the rules precisely wherever they lead. What the rules led to, in this case, was a world that looked completely different from the one a fraction of a decimal point away. He spent time understanding what had happened. The investigation was not hurried. He worked through it carefully, checking against the stored data, confirming that the divergence was real and not a fault of the hardware, and eventually he wrote it up in a 1963 paper that described, for the first time in formal terms, what happens when small differences in the starting conditions of a complex system produce outcomes that are not just slightly different, but effectively unrelated. The paper is considered the foundational document of what came to be called chaos theory, though that name arrived later, and the mathematics inside the paper is considerably more patient and precise than the name suggests. What Lorenz found was not that systems are unpredictable in the sense of being random. They are not random. Every step follows from the one before it, exactly and without exception. What they are is sensitive, exquisitely, unmistakably sensitive to where they begin, in a way that makes long-range prediction not merely difficult, but past a certain horizon, genuinely impossible. The weather 2 weeks from now is not simply hard to forecast because the models are imperfect. It is hard to forecast because the atmosphere begins every day in a state that no instrument can measure with complete precision, and the mathematics that governs air movement amplifies those unmeasurable residuals over time until the error is as large as the forecast itself. This is not a flaw in weather science. It is a property of certain kinds of systems, and it is exactly what the paper described. The specific image Lorenz later used to illustrate the idea, the wing beat of a butterfly in Brazil affecting a tornado in Texas weeks later, was drawn from a conference paper delivered in 1972, and it has since traveled so far from the mathematics that gave it shape that it has become its own distinct cultural object, something people know without necessarily knowing what it came from. The original idea is quieter than the metaphor. It is about a decimal point, typed by hand on a cold morning in Massachusetts, with the hum of a machine the only sound in the room. Not all small numerical differences produce consequences that anyone notices. Most do not. The same sensitivity that allowed Lorenz's simulation to diverge dramatically also means that some deviations correct themselves, or dissipate into the background, or simply do not occur at a place in the system where amplification is possible. The divergence depends not only on the size of the initial difference, but on where in the system it takes place, on whether that particular variable, at that particular moment, is in a position to influence others or is effectively isolated from them. This is part of what makes the mathematics interesting, and also part of what makes it calm. Not every slip of the hand reshapes the world. Some slip into the machinery of things without trace. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, engineers working on the problem of suspension bridge aerodynamics were acutely aware of what wind could do to a structure. The original Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state had collapsed in November 1940, filmed in a grainy footage that became one of the most studied images in structural engineering. The roadway deck twisting and oscillating in a 42-mile-per-hour wind until sections of it fell into the water below. The collapse was not caused by wind speed alone. It was caused by a resonance effect, a kind of aerodynamic feedback that earlier bridge design approaches had not accounted for adequately. The frequency at which the wind was able to push the deck matched too closely the frequency at which the deck naturally wanted to move. The replacement bridge was designed with this failure in mind. The engineers were building stiffness into the structure deliberately, adding truss work to the deck to resist the kind of twisting oscillation that had destroyed the original. Somewhere in the calculation process for the stiffening truss load ratios, a decimal point was misplaced. The specification that resulted was for a significantly more rigid structure than the equations had been targeting. The numbers pointed to stiffness far beyond what the design team had set out to achieve. Before construction began, independent reviewers checked the calculations and found the error. They found something else as well. The overcorrected specification produced aerodynamic stability margins that exceeded any known wind load scenario the bridge would plausibly encounter. The bridge, by being calculated wrong, had been made more stable than the correctly calculated version would have been. The error was documented, the correction noted, and the structure as built incorporated the overcorrected stiffness specification rather than the originally targeted one. The replacement Tacoma Narrows Bridge opened in 1950 and remained in service for decades, eventually joined by a second parallel span in 2007. The deck does not twist. There is a version of this story that focuses on the error as a near miss, the calculation that almost went unnoticed. There is another version that focuses on the stability that resulted. Both are accurate. What is perhaps most worth dwelling on is the third version, quieter than either, in which a number lands in the wrong column on a drafting table in a mid-century engineering office, and the result of that landing is that a bridge over the water in Washington state holds its shape against wind in a way that no other version of the calculation had managed to produce. The error sits inside the structure, invisible and still, bearing its share of the load. On a different scale entirely, the scale of the single cell, and then the population, and then the many generations, there is a change in the human genome that behaves by a logic not entirely different from Lorenz's decimal point. The change is a substitution in the gene that carries instructions for building one chain of the hemoglobin molecule. A single nucleotide is different from the standard sequence. One position in a 3 billion position document reads differently than the version most people carry. The change produces hemoglobin that, under certain conditions, causes red blood cells to take on a curved, narrowed shape instead of the round, pliable disc that blood cells typically assume. When a person inherits one copy of this variant and one standard copy, the blood cells are not dramatically affected under normal conditions. The cells mostly carry oxygen in the ordinary way. What changes is what happens when the malaria parasite, the species called Plasmodium falciparum, attempts to complete part of its life cycle inside the red blood cell. The altered hemoglobin makes the cell a less hospitable environment for the parasite. The infection is less likely to establish itself and progress. This does not mean immunity, exactly. It means resistance, a partial, imperfect, probabilistic shift in the likelihood of severe malaria, rather than a complete barrier against it. But across a population living in a region where malaria has been a consistent presence for long enough, even a partial shift in probability, passed down from parent to child across generations, accumulates into something that researchers including Frank Livingstone, who studied the distribution of this variant across West and Central African populations, beginning in the 1950s, have described as a substantial effect on survival across those generations. The change itself, the original point mutation from which every copy of this variant descends, occurred once, in one person, at some point in the past that cannot be dated precisely. It was not selected for, it was not aimed at anything. It was a copying error, the kind that occurs constantly in living cells, nearly always without consequence. This particular one happened to occur in a location that mattered, in a population that was living in close contact with a parasite for which the resulting change produced a meaningful disadvantage. That combination, a copying error, a parasite, a population, a geography, is what gave the variant its long persistence. The error did not know it was useful, it simply was. The population geneticist looking at maps of this variant's distribution across sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean, overlaid on historical maps of malaria prevalence, sees a pattern that is coherent and documentable, and in some ways quite beautiful in the way that any correspondence between a biological phenomenon and its environmental context is beautiful, the way a response fits its cause, the way a hand fits a particular kind of tool. The response, in this case, was not designed. It emerged from a mistake that happened to be, in this particular context and no other, the right mistake at the right moment. There is an important distinction that exists alongside the wonder of this, and it is worth holding on to. The same variant that provides partial protection in one copy causes severe disease when two copies are inherited rather than one. The biology is not simply protective, it is a trade-off maintained in a population because the partial protection it provides in single copy carriers has in high malaria environments outweighed the cost of the disease it causes in those who inherit two copies. This is the nature of the process, not optimization, not purpose, but a slow statistical sorting of outcomes. What looks from one angle like a gift is from another an illustration of how indifferent the mechanism is. The same process that preserved generations also did harm. Both things are true. The narration does not need to resolve that tension. It is simply what the biology shows. Diane Vaughan spent years in the 1990s reading through documents that described how a space shuttle had been lost. The documents were not dramatic in the way the event had been dramatic. They were memos, meeting minutes, data summaries, decision logs, the administrative record of an organization making choices over time. What she found in that record and described in her 1996 book on the subject was a process she named normalization of deviance, the way that a group of people, over repeated encounters with something that fell slightly outside acceptable parameters, can come to accept that slightly outside parameters as the new normal, and then use that new normal as the baseline against which the next deviation is measured, and so on, link by link, until the accumulated distance from the original standard is very large and no single step in the process was obviously unreasonable. The O-ring seals on the Space Shuttle Challenger's solid rocket boosters had shown signs of erosion on previous flights. The erosion had been noted, analyzed, discussed, and accepted as within manageable limits. Each acceptance was individually reasonable, given the information available at the time and the pressures under which decisions were being made. The next erosion reading was compared to the last accepted reading, rather than to the original design specification. The baseline moved. By the time Challenger launched on the morning of January 28, 1986, the accumulated movement of that baseline had brought the program to a place that the original design parameters had not included within the margin of acceptable risk. What Vaughan identified was not a single mistake, and it was a pattern, a systematic drift produced by many small, individually defensible decisions, each one reasonable in its context, and each one adding a small increment to a cumulative departure that eventually exceeded the tolerance of the system. The disaster at the end of the chain was the result of a process that had been running for years, embedded in the ordinary operations of a large organization, invisible in any single document, but visible, clearly visible, in the full sequence laid out together. The reason this analysis matters in the context of small errors and their consequences is that it describes a direction of travel opposite to the one taken by Lorenz's decimal point and the stiffening truss specification. Those were single deviations that happened by the specific logic of the systems they occurred in to produce outcomes that were not harmful and in some cases produced unexpected stability. Vaughan's analysis describes how many small deviations, each individually absorbed and accepted, can travel in the other direction, not toward unexpected stability, but away from it, gradually and without a clear moment of departure. The mathematics that governs the direction of travel is not fundamentally different. What differs is the geometry of the path, whether the deviation is isolated and resolves, or whether it feeds back into the system and compounds. There is nothing alarming in this observation when it is held in the right register, which is the register of interested attention to how complex systems actually behave. Understanding what makes a deviation resolve versus what makes it compound is genuinely useful, and Vaughan's work contributed to that understanding in ways that extended well beyond aviation and into organizational theory more broadly. The finding is not that errors are dangerous. It is that errors behave differently depending on where they occur, how they are absorbed, and what the feedback structure of the surrounding system looks like. The Tacoma Narrows replacement bridge is stable because its error occurred in a calculation that was reviewed before it was built into anything structural, and because the error happened to increase the property the engineers were most concerned about. The chains of small decisions Vaughan traced ended differently because each decision was reviewed only against the preceding decision and not against the original standard, and because the property being eroded, safety margin, was not the one that daily operational pressures were oriented toward measuring. Same category of event, different architecture, different outcome. In the late 1950s, polio vaccination campaigns were operating in conditions that bore almost no resemblance to a controlled clinical trial. The Salk vaccine had been developed and approved following one of the largest organized medical trials in American history, the 1954 field trial involving over 600,000 children. But distributing a vaccine through a national healthcare system meant moving it along routes that included rural clinics in districts without paved roads, refrigerator chains that could not always be guaranteed, and nursing staff preparing dilutions by hand in facilities that did not have the equipment of a research hospital. The protocol specified dose concentrations carefully because the immunological effect depended on the antigen concentration reaching the body. In certain rural districts, logistical factors produced dilution errors, concentrations of antigen that were higher than the specified protocol. The children in those cohorts received more antigen than the protocol had intended. The deviations were not uniform and were not large enough to produce adverse effects. They were not noticed at the time as significant departures. What researchers found when serological surveys were conducted 5 years and 10 years later, measuring the neutralizing antibody titers in the blood of cohorts who had been vaccinated in the late 1950s, was that the children in the districts with the logistical dilution errors showed higher antibody titers than the children in the correctly dosed comparison groups. The immune response, measured years after the vaccination, was stronger in the cohorts that had received the accidental higher concentration. This is not a simple finding and should not be held as a simple one. The serological survey methodology of the period had its own limitations. The comparison groups were not perfectly matched. The field conditions that produced the dilution errors were also the field conditions that differed from comparison districts in other ways, some of which could have influenced immunity independently. What the finding represents is not a definitive statement that higher antigen concentration always produces stronger long-term immunity, but a documented observation of an unexpected pattern in populations that had been exposed to an unintended variation in a medical intervention. The pattern was real. Its interpretation remained a matter of careful discussion among researchers. The children had received more than the protocol intended, and the measurements made a decade later found something stronger than what the protocol had aimed to produce. What makes this particular instance worth dwelling on, in the context of everything Lorenz and the bridge engineers, and Livingstone and Vaughan were each working through in their different fields, is the way it illustrates that the relationship between an initial deviation and its downstream effect is not fixed by the size or direction of the deviation itself. The dilution error was not large. It did not operate through the same amplifying mechanisms that make weather forecasting impossible past a certain horizon. It did not represent the kind of compounding chain that Vaughan traced through organizational decision-making. It was a logistical imprecision, the kind that occurs routinely when complex protocols meet complicated real-world conditions, and it produced a quiet downstream effect that showed up years later as a line of higher numbers on a page of serological data. The children who walked out of those rural clinics in the late 1950s did not know what had been given to them in a slightly different proportion than the protocol specified. The nurses who prepared the dilutions did not know the concentrations were off. The field conditions made it the kind of deviation that passed without anyone noting it as a deviation at all. The surveys came years later from a different set of researchers asking a different set of questions, and the higher titers appeared in the data as a pattern that took time to identify and longer to understand. By the time the numbers were analyzed and the comparison drawn, the children in those cohorts were in their early 20s, living lives entirely unconnected to the fact that the immunity they carried was slightly different from what the protocol had been designed to give them. There is something specific about the way this kind of finding accumulates that is worth sitting with for a moment. The deviation happened. It was not observed. The effect developed in the background, unhurried, over years, inside the bodies of children who were growing up and doing other things. The researchers who eventually observed the effect were not the ones who would have been in any position to observe the cause. The cause and the effect are separated by a decade, a generation of record keeping, and several layers of coincidence. The decision to conduct the serological survey, the choice of comparison cohorts, the survival and traceability of the original vaccinated populations. Remove any one of those things, and the finding does not appear. The connection between the mishandled dilution and the antibody titer sits invisible in the data until the right sequence of subsequent decisions brings it to light. This is, in a certain sense, true of all the other cases as well. The relationship between Lorenz's rounded decimal and the weather system's divergent behavior was invisible until Lorenz came back to the room and found the printout waiting for him. The relationship between the bridge calculation's decimal error and the span's exceptional stability was invisible until the independent reviewers checked the sheets and confirmed what the wrong number had produced. The relationship between the point mutation in the hemoglobin gene and the population-level resistance to malaria took many generations to become visible in a distribution pattern that population geneticists in the 20th century could map and study. In Vaughan's analysis, the thing that made the chain of decisions visible as a chain required someone to lay out the full sequence of documentation in order and read through it as a unit rather than as a series of individual decisions, each reviewed in isolation. Visibility is not the same as existence. The connection between a cause and its effect does not depend on whether anyone has yet observed it. The decimal point sits in the computer's stored value, whether or not the simulation has been run a second time. The mutation moves through the population, whether or not anyone is mapping its distribution. The bridge stands against wind, whether or not anyone has rechecked the calculation that produced its stiffness. The higher titers are present in the blood, whether or not the serological survey has been conducted yet. Effects exist before they are found. This is perhaps the most restful aspect of the whole picture, that the work of these particular errors, the quiet, unhurried, non-dramatic work of producing outcomes that happen to be unexpectedly good, was already done long before anyone arrived to describe it. The hum in Lorenz's room was the only sound when the simulation was running. The computer did not know it was producing chaos theory. The bridge blueprints on the drafting table held their error without awareness. The mutation moved through West African populations across centuries without intention. The rural nurse, measuring vaccine dilution into a series of small vials in a clinic at the end of a dusty road in the late 1950s, was thinking about the next child in the line and the distance to the next clinic and whether the refrigeration had held through the night. The paper roll in Lorenz's room continued to unfurl, the numbers continuing their patient divergence from the expected path, the gap between what had been predicted and what was actually there growing wider line by line, until the gap was larger than the prediction, and the world inside the machine looked nothing like the world it had started from. The insight that came from that room traveled in the decades after in many directions, into fluid dynamics, into ecology, into the study of financial markets, into biology, into any field that dealt with systems in which initial conditions fed forward through many interactions to produce states that could not have been read off the starting values. What all of those fields took from it, in their various ways, was not anxiety about the fragility of things, but something more like attentiveness, the understanding that a small difference at the right place in a system is a real quantity, not a rounding error, and that attending to where those places are is worth the effort. The mathematics is precise about this. The places where small differences matter are not random and not uniformly distributed. They cluster at certain points in the system's structure, and knowing where those points are is a specific kind of knowledge, patient and accumulated, worth having. Lorenz's room empties at the end of the day. The computer hums on regardless. The printout continues its unfurling in the dark, the numbers accumulating on the roll in the specific order the mathematics produces, diverging from the path they were supposed to take, tracing the shape of a world that began from a number read off a paper strip in the middle of the afternoon by a researcher who was trying to save time and found instead something that would take years to name and decades to fully trace, and that sits still at the root of how complex systems are understood, not as machines that amplify errors into disasters, but as structures of a particular and interesting kind of sensitivity, where the small and the large are connected by chains of consequence that are perfectly logical, exactly the right length, and very often invisible until the right person comes back to the room and checks the printout. A child walks out of a rural vaccination clinic in the late afternoon of some day in the late 1950s, stepping from a dim interior into light that is thick and golden at that hour, the dust of the road rising slightly around her feet. She carries nothing visible. The immunity in her bloodstream is already beginning its quiet work, the immune response already learning what it has been shown, storing the information in the cellular structures that will hold it for years, for decades, for longer than the clinic will remain open, longer than the nurse inside will continue working, longer than the records of this particular district's vaccination program will be kept in any filing cabinet anywhere. The work is done before it is measurable. The protection is there before the survey that finds it. She walks out into the afternoon in an ordinary way, toward the road that leads back to wherever she has come from, carrying in her blood something slightly stronger than the protocol intended, and the afternoon light holds everything in the specific still quality that late afternoon light in open country has, wide and unhurried, settling slowly, requiring nothing. The stone marker at the edge of AM Village is roughly the height of a man's knee, worn smooth by years of Derbyshire weather, and rounded at the top the way limestone rounds when rain touches it repeatedly across many decades. Its surface is gray pale, almost white where the morning light catches it, and at the center of its flat upper face, someone has carved a shallow hollow, a cup the size of two hands pressed together, and filled it with vinegar. At the bottom of that cup, if the light is right and the angle is correct, a coin rests. It sits there in the morning of 1665, in the autumn, in the gray cool air that comes in from the moorland to the north of the village, and it is the physical center of a decision that the approximately 350 people of Eyam had made together to stay inside their boundary, to receive what they needed from the outside world through exactly this kind of exchange, and not to carry what they were carrying any further than this stone. The plague had arrived in a bundle of cloth from London. That is the particular record. A tailor in the village received cloth from a London merchant, and within days people in the household where the cloth was stored began to fall ill. By the autumn of 1665, Rector William Mompesson and the village's former rector Thomas Stanley had persuaded the community to draw a cordon around itself, a ring of boundary markers, at which food and supplies could be left, and payment could be made in vinegar-soaked coins. The vinegar believed to cleanse what the coins might otherwise carry. The ring held. The surrounding towns of Bakewell and Sheffield, both within a reasonable distance of Eyam's winding roads, recorded no significant outbreak that could be traced to the village. What the vinegar cup held at the bottom of that marker was not just payment for bread or salt or candles. It was the physical form of a boundary that the village had drawn between its own situation and the world beyond it. Not a wall, not a fence, nothing that could be seen from a distance, just a series of stones and a practice, held steady by the collective agreement of a community that understood what it was doing and chose to do it anyway. The coin resting at the bottom of the vinegar pool catches a small piece of pale morning light. It is worn enough that the inscription on it is hard to read. Someone from a farm, a mile down the road, left it there and did not come closer. Someone from inside the boundary will come and take it later and leave what the coin paid for. This is how the arrangement worked, day after day, through the autumn and into the following year. Gritstone walls run along the hillsides around Eyam. They are the particular gray of northern English stone, laid without mortar in the traditional Derbyshire fashion, each stone fitting against the next through careful placement, rather than anything that binds them, and yet they hold, have held for centuries, will hold long after the village has moved through many other seasons and many other chapters of its life. The hills beyond those walls roll gently northward toward the moor, and in October the bracken on their lower slopes turns amber, and below it the grass stays green into early winter. The boundary markers that Eyam placed along its perimeter were not built the way those walls were built. They were already there, existing stones repurposed for a new use, given a new meaning by the practice that gathered around them. After the outbreak ended in 1666, they remained standing where they had always stood, looking the same as they always had. The town of Bakewell, 7 miles to the northwest, continued through the period of Eyam's cordon without the specific disruption that the neighboring village was experiencing. Its market operated, its bridge over the Wye held its ordinary traffic. The distance between Bakewell and Eyam in those months was not 7 miles by road, It was the distance between the inside of the cordon and the outside of it, a distance maintained not by geography, but by the decision that a community made about where it ended and where the wider world began. The stone markers are still there today. Some of them visitors walk past every year, stopping to read the small informational signs that explain what the cup-shaped hollow in the top of each one was for. Great. Near the southern coast of Cuba, in the low-lying district around the town of Yucaro, there is a structure that local accounts describe as the wrong wall built in the right place. During the 10 Years' War, a labor crew working on a military troca, a fortified line of clearings and earthworks that Cuban colonial authorities used to divide and control the island, was assigned to construct a defensive embankment near the town. The orders they received were misread or misunderstood, and the berm they built faced the wrong direction. By military logic, it was pointed away from what it was supposed to protect against. By the logic of weather, which the orders had not considered, it faced the sea. The berm stood. It was not immediately corrected, because the war's demands were unrelenting, and a misbuilt earthwork in a secondary position was not the first concern of the commanders responsible for hundreds of miles of this defensive line. And then the war moved on, and then the war ended, and the berm remained standing in the position it had been given by the crew that built it, facing seaward, thick-based, angled slightly downward at the water side where the drainage had worked the earth over several years. When a major hurricane came through the region, the storm surge it pushed ahead of it encountered the berm before it encountered the town's lower residential districts. The water broke against it and turned, and the residential streets behind the berm received considerably less of the surge than the areas to either side. The phrase "the wrong wall built in the right place" comes from local accounts of this event, preserved in the community's memory of how the town's geography and its history are related. It is the kind of name a community gives something when the thing it describes is too particular and too specific to be captured by the ordinary names for structures. The berm existed because someone read their orders wrong. It faced the sea because no one corrected the error in time. It stood in its position for years before the storm arrived, looking like nothing more than a low earthen ridge, slightly overgrown at the edges, visited by nobody. When the storm came, it was exactly where it needed to be. Jocaro's lower streets, the ones the berm protected, are built close to the water. The buildings there are the kind that accumulate in fishing towns and small coastal settlements. Low, practical, adapted over generations to the particular demands of a place that knows the sea is nearby and that the sea has moods. The streets run at angles that older coastal maps will sometimes explain by the long-ago positions of wharves and landing points that no longer exist in their original form. When the storm surge came and the berm turned it, the water that did reach the lower streets found a place already built with an understanding of water, raised thresholds, drainage channels laid into the street edges, habits of preparation that coastal communities develop over time. But the berm reduced what reached them, and the berm was there because a labor crew, somewhere in the middle of a long war, read their orders incorrectly and built their wall the wrong way around. There is a particular kind of practical irony that settles around objects like this berm, not irony in the literary sense, where meaning reverses itself sharply, but the quieter version, where something made for one purpose turns out to serve an entirely different one, without drama, simply by remaining in place long enough for its other usefulness to become apparent. The berm was built to face a military threat that the war eventually resolved in ways that made the specific earthwork irrelevant. It faced the sea instead, and the sea eventually tested it. In the Subansiri district of the eastern Himalayas, where the hills rise steeply from valley floors and the mountainsides are terraced wherever the slope will allow, a retaining wall was extended in the wrong direction during its construction. The specific circumstances involve a miscommunication between a lead builder and his assistants, but the kind of directional misunderstanding that happens in steep terrain, where orientation is complicated by the angle of the slope and the limited sight lines between workers positioned at different points on the hillside. The wall was meant to extend along one line. It extended along another, the angle off in a way that created an unintended diagonal brace against the hillside rather than the level terrace edge that had been planned. The Assam earthquake of August 15th, 1950, had a magnitude of 8.6. It was one of the largest earthquakes recorded in the 20th century, and it triggered debris flows and landslides across a wide area of the eastern Himalayas, reshaping hillsides and valley floors over the hours and days that followed the initial event. In the Subansiri district, a debris flow moved down the hillside above the settlement and encountered the diagonal retaining wall. The wall, built at the wrong angle for its intended purpose, sat in exactly the position needed to deflect the flow to the side of the main cluster of village dwellings. The debris went where the wall directed it, which was not where the debris would have gone without the wall, and the main cluster of buildings remained. The hands that set those stones into the diagonal line they occupy were working from instructions they had partly misheard or partly misunderstood. They were setting stones into a hillside in the eastern Himalayas in the ordinary manner of people who have always built terraces and walls on slopes, by feel as much as by plan, adjusting to the specific surface of the specific hill they were working on, placing each stone where the previous stone's angle suggested the next one should go. The wall that resulted from their work was not what anyone had designed. It was what the communication between the designer and the builders, imperfect across the noise and distance of a steep hillside, produced. It stood in its diagonal position for years before the earthquake of 1950 registered anywhere. After the earthquake, the debris field left by the flow shows clearly in the landscape where the material came to rest. Forms a ridge at the lower edge of the hill, slightly to one side of the village dwellings, and it is still there, consolidated by decades of vegetation growing through it, grasses and shrubs rooting into the material that the earthquake brought down the slope. The retaining wall is still there too, incorporated now into the landscape in the way that old stone walls are incorporated when the landscape has moved around them and settled again, no longer a boundary between one use and another, but simply part of the hillside's texture, a line of stones that has been there long enough to belong. In the Kainuu region of eastern Finland, the winter of 1939 and 1940 was cold in the particular way that eastern Finnish winters are cold, sustained and gray, the light arriving late and leaving early, the birch forests standing bare in the flat snow between settlements. The Battle of Suomsalmi took place across this terrain, Finnish ski troops using the forest and the cold and the particular features of the landscape to encircle Soviet divisional forces that had advanced along the roads. The Finnish flanking maneuvers were demanding operations in extreme conditions, and the supply situation for the units conducting them was a continuous concern. A reserve ammunition and equipment cache had been routed to the wrong forest depot by a logistical error. The specific details of the misrouting belong to the administrative record of the campaign. A designation transposed, a route marker misread, supplies arriving somewhere other than where they were directed to go. The wrong depot, it turned out, was positioned along the exact route that Finnish ski troops were using for their flanking movement. The cache was there when the units moving through needed replenishment. In a forest in the Kainu region in December, the snow around the depot undisturbed until the first patrol found it and stopped. The soldier who finds it in the dark would stop with a torch and look at what is in front of him: ammunition, provisions, exactly what the unit needs at exactly the moment it needs them, and there would be a pause before the others arrive. This is not because he is doing anything other than confirming what he can see. The pause is simply what happens in a cold forest when something goes unexpectedly right. The birch trees stand around the depot in the dark. The snow is deep enough that moving through it has been slow work all day. The cache is here because someone in a supply office transposed a designation and sent it somewhere other than the correct location, and the correct location was somewhere it would not have been found by these particular soldiers at this particular point in the encirclement. Finnish ski troops in the Kainu region during the winter campaign moved through terrain that Soviet mechanized forces could not easily follow. The forests and the cold were familiar ground to the Finnish units, and difficult, disorienting ground to the forces they were encircling. The misrouted cache contributed to the sustainability of the Finnish flanking operation. The encirclement of 2 Soviet divisions was completed and held. These are the documented outcomes. The depot in the forest, misrouted by a clerical error in a supply office, was one of the small pieces of what made the operation work, not the decisive piece. Nothing in a campaign like that has only one decisive piece, but a piece that was in the right place because it had been sent to the wrong one. The birch forests of the Kainu region in winter are quiet in the specific way of cold forests at night. The snow absorbs sound, the trees are too bare to catch wind, the distances between settlements are long enough that the ordinary sounds of human habitation do not carry. The patrol moving through that forest before the cache was found was making as little noise as it could, which was already less noise than the landscape required of the snow underfoot. When the torch found the cache and the soldier stopped, the forest was quiet around him. The snow went on in every direction. The birches stood in the dark. On a hillside above the town of Civita di Bagnoregio, in the Lazio region of central Italy, the light at this time of year, in the late afternoon in autumn, falls at a long, shallow angle across the plateau and the valley below. Civita di Bagnoregio sits on a mesa of tufa, a volcanic rock formed in layers over long geological time, and the plateau has been eroding at its edges for centuries, the cliff faces dropping material into the valley below as the tufa weathers. The town is connected to the road that serves the valley by a pedestrian bridge, a long narrow span that arrives at the town's single gate from a steep switchback path below. Across that bridge and through that gate is the town's interior, its medieval street plan, its pre-Etruscan foundations, its buildings of pale tufa and older stone, a place that has been continuously inhabited and largely unchanged in its fundamental character for a very long time. In the late 19th century, a regional road planning survey examined the plateau and its surroundings as part of a general assessment of routes that might connect the hilltop town to the road network in the valley below. The surveyors assessed the northern cliff face of the plateau, the one that offered the most geometrically direct approach, and the data they recorded from their instruments showed the cliff as more unstable than engineering of the period could accommodate. The survey concluded that a proper road connection on the northern face was structurally unfeasible. Engineering funds and attention went elsewhere. Civita di Bagnoregio did not receive the road connection. The data the surveyors recorded was not correct. Their instruments, or their interpretation of the cliff face's stability, produced numbers that misrepresented what the geology actually was. This was a late 19th century survey team working in the specific conditions of that period, with the instruments available, with the training available in terrain where geological assessment was partly art and partly science, and partly the accumulated judgment of the surveyor looking at what was in front of him. The northern cliff face's actual structural characteristics were different from what the survey reported. What the survey reported was sufficient to prevent the construction that would otherwise have followed. Conservation architects examining Civitate di Bagnoregio in later periods have noted the particular consequence of the town's road isolation. In comparable hilltop towns throughout Lazio and Umbria, the arrival of road connections in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought construction activity, population movement, and development that altered the medieval street plans and pre-modern building fabric of those towns substantially. Civita di Bagnoregio did not receive this. The population that the town held in the late 19th century declined gradually across the following decades, as the difficulty of access made it impractical for residents engaged in the ordinary economies of the region. What remained, as the population reduced to a very small permanent community, was the physical fabric of the town, the street plan, the buildings, the proportions between them, essentially intact, because no road had arrived to occasion their modification. The survey team's wrong numbers are the primary reason, not the only reason. Geography, economic history, the particular character of the tufa rock, the long, slow erosion of the plateau's edges, all of these contributed to Civita di Bagnoregio becoming what it is. But the survey's incorrect assessment of the northern cliff face was the specific decision point that closed off the construction future that would have followed a road. The instruments the surveyors used were packed up and carried back down the hill. Their notebooks went into the regional archive. The town above them continued its quiet life. Below, what the survey team saw from the hillside on the day they were there was the plateau from below, the tufa cliff face above them, pale and layered, the town's roof lines just visible over the rim, the long shadow, the mesa cast across the valley in the afternoon. They would have had a view of the Tiber Valley to the north, the kind of wide, clear view that these hilltop positions provide in the Lazio landscape, where the light in autumn is thin and even and carries a long way. They packed their instruments, noted their readings in their notebooks, and came down the hillside. The readings they had taken were wrong. They did not know this. The town above them did not know this. The tufa plateau that Civita di Bagnoregio sits on has been losing material from its edges across many centuries and will continue to do so. The cliff faces drop sections of themselves into the valley below in patterns determined by the internal structure of the volcanic rock, the way water moves through it, the expansion and contraction of its surface across the seasons. The northern cliff face, the one the surveyors assessed incorrectly, has continued its slow process of erosion across the decades since. What the survey described as unstable was in fact a specific configuration of rock that the surveyor's instruments did not read correctly. The instability they documented was not there in the form they recorded it, but their documentation was sufficient to prevent a road, and the road's absence has preserved, in the town above them, something that was there long before the survey team arrived. The pedestrian bridge from the valley to the town gate is long and thin and exposed, and walking across it in any wind requires some attention to how the wind is moving. The gate it arrives at is a medieval gate, stone-framed, with a carved face above the arch that looks out over the valley, with the particular expression of stone carvings that have been looking at weather for several hundred years, patient, worn smooth at the most prominent surfaces, entirely indifferent to what passes below. Through the gate, the street that leads into the town is paved with tufa stone, worn smooth by the footsteps of a great many centuries. The buildings on either side are close enough that neighbors on opposite sides of the street could pass an object hand to hand from first floor windows, though the windows are not generally open at the same time, and the neighbors are not generally doing this. The street plan of Civita di Bagnoregio retains the proportions and the alignments of a medieval Italian hill town, the narrow lanes that open into small piazzas, the way one street finds another at an angle that makes sense only in relation to the building that occupied the corner during the town's formation, the walls that end in subtle curves because the builders were adjusting to the edge of the plateau rather than following a grid. None of these features were particularly unusual among hilltop towns in this part of Italy in the 19th century. What is unusual is that they remain incomparable towns where roads arrived and development followed. The 19th and 20th centuries modified, replaced, and in many cases substantially rebuilt the physical fabric that had previously been there. In Civita di Bagnoregio, the road did not arrive. The surveyor's wrong numbers are the reason the numbers on the ground, the alignments and angles and proportions of the streets, stayed as they were. The autumn light on the plateau arrives from the southwest in the later afternoon hours and moves across the tufa stone of the streets and building faces at an angle that shows the texture of the stone clearly. The small cavities and ridges of the volcanic rock surface, the places where it has been dressed and the places where it is still rough, the thin bands of different mineral composition that run through the stone at slight angles to the horizontal, laid down when the tufa was still forming. In this light, the town looks the color of warm sand, slightly orange where the rock is most volcanic, and pale gray where it has been exposed to weather for longest. The shadows in the narrow lanes are deep and cool. The tufa underfoot is warm from the day. Very few people live in Civita di Bagnoregio year-round. The number of permanent residents has been small for a long time, reduced by the practical difficulties that the absence of a road creates for anyone who needs to participate in the ordinary economy of the surrounding region. The visitors who come, and many do, across the year, make the walk up the path to the bridge and across the bridge to the gate and through the gate into the town, and what they find there is the physical consequence of a survey team's mistaken readings from a hillside in the 1880s. They find the street plan, they find the buildings and the proportions and the positions they occupied before any road could have changed them. They find the tufa worn smooth by centuries of feet and the carved gate looking out over the valley, and the thin light of a late autumn afternoon moving across the surfaces of stones that have been where they are for longer than anyone currently alive can directly verify. The town on its plateau from the valley below looks as it has always looked, a compact mass of buildings on the rim of the Tufa Mesa, a cluster of tiled rooftops above pale stone walls, the church tower rising above the rest, the valley opening away on all sides into the Lazio landscape. The bridge connects it to what is below, but the bridge is thin enough that from a distance it is barely visible, and the town appears to rest on its plateau without visible means of connection, the way a boat rests on still water. After the surveying team descended the hillside in 1880, with their instruments and their notebooks and their incorrect readings, the afternoon continued in the ordinary way. The light moved across the valley. The Tufa Plateau cast its long shadow. The town above continued its quiet life. The cooking fires lit, the sound of feet on Tufa pavement, the carved gate, looking out over the valley as it had looked for several hundred years. No one in the town knew that a road had just not been built. No one knew that the numbers in the surveyor's notebook were wrong. No one knew that the train would not come, that the development would not come, that the town would remain as it was. The hillside where the survey team had been is simply a hillside. In the autumn, after the survey team had gone, it held the dry grass and the pale stone of the Lazio landscape, the slope angling up toward the plateau edge, the tufa cliff face above, the wide valley light falling across everything at a long, even angle. The path the team had used to approach and then descend was already fading back into the hillside, the way paths in dry terrain fade when they are not regularly used. A few seasons of rain and growth, and the path would be difficult to trace. Below the hillside, the town, the same street plan it had always had, the same gate, the same carved face above the arch, looking out with the patience that stone has when it has been looking at weather for long enough that weather is simply what is always there. The shadow of the plateau moving across the valley floor as the afternoon progressed, the dry grass on the hillside still, the air in the valley quiet. No train ever came, no road arrived on the northern face of the plateau. The survey's numbers remained in the archive, where the regional engineers had filed them, and the engineers had moved on to the projects that the survey's conclusion had freed them to prioritize elsewhere. The town remained on its plateau. The street plan remained as it was. The tufa underfoot was worn another season's worth smooth by the feet of people who lived there and had always lived there and continued to do so. In autumn stillness, after the surveying team is gone, the hillside holds the quiet that the Lazio landscape holds in the hours when the light is failing and the day's warmth is still in the stone, but the air is beginning to cool. The town above is a silhouette against the evening sky, compact and particular, its proportions fixed, its stones exactly where they were placed centuries ago by hands that were building a town and not thinking about a road that would not arrive for many centuries, and that when it arrived in the minds of regional engineers would be turned aside by a set of numbers that were slightly wrong. The path where the railway corridor would have been is a slope of dry grass and stone. It is the particular gray gold of Italian hillside vegetation in October. The grass is dried and bent slightly by the wind that moves through the valley in the afternoon. The stones half buried in the slope, the tufa pale at the surface where the light catches it. Nothing is here. Nothing was built here. The slope runs from the valley floor up to the base of the plateau cliff, and it is the same slope it has always been, and the town at the top of the cliff is the same town it has always been, and the future that the survey's wrong numbers prevented. The road, the railway, the construction, the modification of the street plan is simply a future that did not arrive. A future that did not arrive is not in this light an absence. The slope of dry grass and stone is not empty. The town on its plateau is not incomplete. What is there? The tufa street worn smooth, the carved gate, the narrow lanes at their medieval angles, the buildings in their old proportions, is there precisely because the other thing is not. The stillness of the hillside in the autumn afternoon, the dry grass bent in the wind, the pale stone catching the last of the western light. This is the shape of what the wrong numbers left behind. The town continues its quiet. The afternoon continues its slow withdrawal of light. The carved face above the gate looks out over the valley as it has always looked, with the patience that stone develops when it has been in one place long enough that it simply is that place, not waiting for anything, not regretting anything, simply present in the manner of old stone in old light. The hillside below is still. The path that would have been a railway corridor is dry grass and stone, exactly as it was before anyone came to survey it, and will remain so as the evening settles quietly over the plateau and the valley and the Lazio landscape, spreading out in all its old, unhurried width. In a Japanese farming village, on the eastern side of a wooden gatepost, a latch faces the wrong direction. It has faced the wrong way since the autumn. The gate was hung when the carpenter set the hardware down in the mud, picked it up without looking, and fixed it to the post in the position his hands found naturally, rather than the position the drawing had shown. The latch's tongue points inward, now instead of outward. The metal is slightly pitted from 3 winters of frost. Every morning the farmer who works this land closes the gate behind him with the motion his hand has learned. A small twist to the left, a lift, a push, the reverse sequence of what a correctly hung latch would require. He does it without thinking. He has never considered correcting it, partly because correcting it would require a different set of tools than he keeps readily to hand, and partly because the winter that followed its installation was the mildest anyone in the village could remember, and there is a kind of logic that resists undoing things that worked. The morning light comes across the top of the gate at a low angle in winter, and where it strikes the latch plate, it makes a small bright line of reflection on the post wood above. This is the particular detail neighbors have noticed and remembered, not the gate's wrongness. Exactly. More the quality of light the wrongness happens to produce. The two things have become, over time, inseparable in the way that small landmarks become inseparable from the accidents that shape them. Within agricultural communities across Japan, in the Tohoku region in the north, in Kyushu in the south, in the farming valleys that sit between mountain ranges in the interior, a recurring pattern appears in folk narrative traditions, documented by scholars including Noriko Rader, in which a craftsman's or a farmer's error turns out, by the logic of the story, to have been the thing that protected the community. A field planted at the wrong angle, a wall built facing the wrong way, a gate hung backward on its post. The error is not corrected by the story. It is honored, corrected by the story. It is honored. The narrative does not explain the protection in mechanical terms. It does not always specify exactly why the angle of the field or the direction of the gate matters. What it preserves is the structure of the event, that something done incorrectly was what held. Scholars who have studied these traditions note that they are not simply reassurances told to clumsy carpenters. They carry, within their formal structure, something more practically useful than that. The story encodes a posture toward imperfection, a communal willingness to observe what happens after a mistake, rather than immediately rushing to correct it. In a farming community, where the land returns different results from the same field in different years, where weather overrides planning and timing overrides intention, this posture has a real function. It makes room for outcomes that calculation did not predict. It keeps the community attentive to what actually occurred, rather than exclusively to what was supposed to occur. The reversed latch on the gatepost is a small thing. The light it catches at dawn is smaller, but within the traditions Reader has documented, it is exactly these small, specific, unremarkable details, the direction of a latch, the angle of a row of planted grain, the placement of a stone, that the stories choose to preserve. The stories do not reach for grand gestures. They stay close to the ground, where the actual events are, and they hold what they find there with care. There is a different kind of story, from a very different tradition, that also begins with a mistaken reading, but one made against a sky rather than against a set of carpenter's marks. The Hopi people of the American Southwest have maintained for many generations a body of oral knowledge relating to the movement of the sun across the horizon and the ways in which particular alignments with landforms or markers signal the proper timing of agricultural and ceremonial activities. This knowledge is precise and has been refined over centuries of sustained observation, but knowledge that depends on human observation also depends on human perception, and human perception is not always exact. Ethnographer Eckhard Malotki, who spent years working with Hopi speakers to document oral traditions in their own terms, has recorded a tradition in which a group of elders misread a solar observation, interpreted a particular alignment as an earlier seasonal marker than it was, and on the basis of this reading, brought the community's planned relocation to higher ground forward by several weeks ahead of its proper schedule. The packing began earlier than it otherwise would have. The movement across the plateau began earlier. The people settled into the higher site while the original location was still dry and unremarkable, not yet showing any sign of what would come. When the floodwaters rose and reached the original settlement site at exactly the period when the community would still have been there, had the reading been correct, the site was empty. The Hopi tradition does not preserve this as a story about a mistake that happened to work out. It preserves it as a story about sacred guidance operating through human imperfection. The error in reading is not the point in this tradition's terms. The point is that something moved the community to safety, and that this something worked through the means available to it, which in this case happened to be the particular limitations of human solar observation on a particular morning. Malotki's documentation of this tradition is careful to preserve the terms in which Hopi speakers themselves understood what occurred. The concept that error can be a vehicle for something larger than the person making the error has its own weight within this tradition, its own relationship to a broader set of beliefs about how the world works and how human communities exist within it. To understand the tradition fairly is to hold it on its own terms, not to import a framework from outside and measure it against a different set of assumptions about what errors are and what they mean. What is particular to this tradition, what makes it distinct from the Japanese gate story, though both involve a community protected by something that went wrong, is precisely the nature of the misreading. It is not a carpenter's inattention. It is not a logistical slip. It is a misreading of the sun, of the horizon, of the markers set in stone by people who came before. There is something in the weight of that, the idea that the very system built to guide the community accurately became, in this instance, the instrument of its preservation by being read slightly incorrectly, that the Hopi tradition holds and preserves without attempting to resolve. The Anansi stories come from a different direction entirely. In the storytelling traditions of the Akan people of West Africa, Anansi the spider is a figure of extraordinary resourcefulness and equally extraordinary unreliability. He is not a hero in any simple sense. He sets out to acquire what he wants by means that are clever and oblique, and he often succeeds, but not always in the way he planned, and not always to the effect he intended, and frequently through a sequence of events in which his own errors become, in retrospect, the operative cause of whatever good arrives. Folklorist Roger Abrahams, in his 1983 collection of African folk tales, identified a recurring structural feature in Anansi narratives that he connected to a pedagogical function about adaptive response to self-caused difficulty. In a widely distributed variant of this pattern, Anansi sets out to steal food from a malevolent forest spirit, a task requiring stealth, precision, and a clean exit. He manages, predictably, none of these. He makes noise at the wrong moment. He drops something. He draws attention to himself in exactly the way that the plan required him not to. The theft collapses, and Anansi retreats loudly through the undergrowth with the forest spirit in pursuit, and the village watching from the tree line sees something they had not been able to see before. The forest spirit, in its fury at Anansi, moves in a way that reveals the pattern of its vulnerabilities. Its response to disruption shows the community what disruption does to it, where its attention goes, what it cannot track, where the gaps in its awareness are. The villagers observe all of this from a safe distance, from the exact distance that Anansi's failed and noisy retreat created. Abrahams reads this structural pattern as encoding something quite specific, the idea that self-caused difficulty, when it produces genuine disruption in a system that was previously opaque, can provide information that no careful, correct approach would have generated. Anansi's failure changes the conditions under which the village understands its situation. The forest spirit is still the forest spirit, but now its shape is visible. What the Akan storytelling tradition does with this structure is not to present it as instruction in the form of a lesson. It is not a manual. It is a story that has been told and retold by people who know it well enough to find in it something that remains interesting after many tellings, which is usually the sign of a story that has found its way to something genuinely true. The structure is not hidden. Listeners know Anansi will fail at what he sets out to do. The interest is in the form the failure takes, and what the failure makes possible, and whether the possibility will be recognized and used. The story asks its audience to hold two things at once: the reality of Anansi's failure and the reality of what the failure accomplished. Neither cancels the other. This is not a resolution, it is a relationship between two facts that the tradition has found worth preserving. The Norse literary tradition, set down in Icelandic vellum manuscripts from the medieval period, approaches the theme of protective misfortune from a very different cultural position, one shaped by the specific conditions of maritime navigation in the North Atlantic, where the consequences of navigational error were understood to be potentially total, and where the idea that apparent misfortune could conceal a different logic had a particular urgency. The Flómana saga is one of the sagas of Icelanders preserved in vellum manuscripts and belonging to the body of Old Norse narrative that saga scholars have examined in terms of its literary conventions, its documentary value, and its relationship to the broader Norse cultural worldview. In one episode, a crew is driven off course by weather, by misjudgment, or by some combination of both, and finds itself on the Greenland coast at a location that was not its destination. The men are tired. They are unhappy about their navigation. They have arrived somewhere they did not intend to arrive. The saga explicitly notes that the ship that maintained the correct course, the ship that did not make the navigational error, was later destroyed in a storm in the waters the misnavigating crew had avoided. This is not presented as an aside. The saga includes it deliberately because it is the structural point of the episode. The wrong course and the correct course diverge. The wrong course survives. The correct course does not. Saga scholar Vestine Olason has connected this kind of narrative moment to a broader Norse cultural belief that apparent misfortune conceals protective logic, that the shape of what is actually happening is not always visible in the moment of its happening, and that what presents itself as error or disaster may be, in a larger frame, neither. This belief has a specific relationship to the conditions of North Atlantic seafaring, where the difference between a storm encountered and a storm avoided was often the difference between return and absence, and where the reasons for that difference were not always traceable to anything a navigator had chosen correctly. The The Greenland shore where the misnavigating crew lands is specific in the saga's terms, a real place, cold and unexpected, but with characteristics that allow the men to survive and eventually to continue. One of them walks to the top of a low ridge to get his bearings. Looking back across the water toward the route they were supposed to have taken, he would see if the saga's geography holds the space where the storm is now moving. The route they were supposed to follow is inside it. The route they actually followed has brought them here, to solid ground, to an unexpected landfall, to a place they know only because they got something wrong. The saga does not ask its audience to celebrate the error, it asks them to see its consequence. And it asks this within a tradition that had, over generations of North Atlantic navigation, developed a genuine pragmatic interest in the question of which outcomes a particular error produces, because in that tradition, the answer sometimes mattered more than the classification. The fifth tradition in this gathering comes from a valley in the mountains of western Sichuan province, in what is now the Aba Tibetan and Chang Autonomous Prefecture. The story was collected in fieldwork carried out in the 1980s and is preserved in archival collections held at Sichuan University's Folklore Archive. It is a founding story, the kind of narrative that a community keeps as an account of how its existence began, of what circumstances made it possible for people to be in this particular place rather than somewhere else. In the story, a merchant is traveling through mountain terrain using a map. The map has an error in it. The pass marked on the map as the route through the mountains is not the pass the merchant actually takes. The real geography and the mapped geography diverge, and the merchant, following the map, finds himself in a different configuration of ridges and valleys than the one he expected. He is, by the logic of navigation, lost. He has followed a document that led him somewhere the document did not know existed. The place he arrives in is a valley. It has a spring. It has shelter from the surrounding peaks. It has, the story makes clear, characteristics that make it genuinely livable, not as a compromise, not as a consolation for not reaching the intended destination, but as a place in its own right. The merchant sits beside the spring. He has the wrong map open on his knee. He looks at the valley, at the peaks surrounding it, at the way the water moves through the grass, and he does not go back. The tradition ends with the community founded in this valley, explicitly attributing its existence and its prosperity to the mapmaker's error. The founding merchant, according to this tradition, never corrected the original document. The wrong pass remained marked on the map as the route. This was not forgetfulness. The tradition frames it as a form of honor, a decision to leave the error intact because the error was the thing that brought the merchant here, and correcting it would be in some sense a form of ingratitude toward the wrong turn. What the 1980s fieldwork captured, and what the Sichuan University archive holds, is the tradition as it was still living in the communities of the region, not as a historical curiosity, but as a story people still told, because it still said something they needed to say. Founding stories function this way. They preserve the terms in which a community understands its own existence, and communities generally return to those terms when the question of what they are and how they came to be here feels, for whatever reason, worth asking again. The map with the error on it, the wrong pass marked in whatever pigment or ink was available when it was made, the mountains around it rendered in the approximate and interpretive way of mountain maps drawn by hand, is not an artifact of failure. In the terms of this tradition, it is an artifact of arrival. It shows where the merchant was told to go and where he actually ended up, and the gap between the two is where the valley is. Each of these traditions, the Japanese Gate, the Hopi Elders, the Anansi stories, the Norse saga, the Sichuan founding narrative, holds a relationship between error and outcome that is distinct from each of the others. The differences matter and are worth holding separately. In the Japanese farming tradition, the error is physical and small, a carpenter's inattention, and what the tradition preserves is a posture of observation. Watch what happens before correcting, because what happens may be better than what was planned. In the Hopi tradition, the error is perceptual, a misreading of a solar alignment, and what the tradition preserves is a cosmological understanding in which the distinction between human error and sacred guidance is not fixed. In the Anansi tradition, the error is strategic, a failed theft that nevertheless reveals what careful success would not have revealed, and what the tradition preserves is a structural insight about the information value of disruption. In the Norse tradition, the error is navigational, and what the tradition preserves is an epistemological humility about the relationship between the apparent shape of events and their actual consequences. In the Sichuan tradition, the error is cartographic, and what the tradition preserves is a founding community's gratitude toward the document that led their ancestors somewhere the document didn't know was there. These are 5 different things. They share a family resemblance: error, unexpected outcome, preservation of the error's consequence, but the resemblance is a surface one, and the substance of each tradition is its own. What is common to all of them, perhaps, is not a message but a practice. Each tradition has found a way to hold the error in view, rather than dissolving it into a retroactive success story in which everything looked at rightly was really fine. The Japanese gate is still a reversed latch. The Hopi reading was still incorrect by the standards of the sky-watching tradition, and Anansi still failed at the theft. The crew was still off course. The map was still wrong. The traditions do not correct these things. They keep them visible because the thing that happened, the protection, the survival, the arrival in the valley, came out of those specific wrong things, and erasing them from the story would erase the mechanism of what occurred. There is a kind of intelligence in this. It is not comfortable intelligence. Exactly. It does not offer the reassurance that everything happens for a reason, or that errors are secretly perfect, or that getting things wrong is a strategy. What it offers is more specific and more honest than that. The observation, repeated across very different cultures and very different conditions, that the outcome of an error is not always worse than the outcome of accuracy, and that the response to discovering this observation, attention, the willingness to leave the document uncorrected when the document led somewhere worth being, is itself a form of knowledge. These traditions have been carried by communities for a long time. They have survived the conditions that ended other stories, accumulated tellers, crossed generations. Something in them has remained worth passing on, not because they are beautiful, though some of them are, but because they continue to describe something real about the way errors and outcomes relate to each other in the world that communities actually inhabit. The world where navigation fails in storms, where solar observation has limits on particular mornings, where carpenters set hardware down in the mud and pick it up without looking, where maps are made by people who have not walked every pass, and the gatepost catches its line of morning light at the same low angle it has caught it every winter since the latch was reversed. The village has not corrected it. The years have come, and the years have gone, and nothing has been undone, and the small wrong angle the metal makes against the wood continues to produce the same thin stripe of brightness across the post above it, reliable as the season, familiar as the sound of the farmer's hand, doing the reversed motion it learned a long time ago. The Sichuan University Archive holds in its collection of 1980s fieldwork materials the record of a story that was still living in the communities of the Aba region at the time of its collection. The spring in the valley still runs, presumably. The peaks still surround it. The founding merchant in the tradition's account sat beside the water with the wrong map and made a decision, or arrived at something that felt less like a decision than an understanding about where he was and what it meant to be there. And the map is in the archive. The wrong pass is still marked on it in faded ink. The mountains it drew are still approximate, still interpretive, still slightly different from the mountains that were actually there. The gap between the drawn mountains and the real ones is where the valley is. It has always been there, in the space between what the document said and what the land was. The merchant honored the error by leaving it. The tradition has honored the merchant by keeping the story. The archive has held both, quietly, since the 1980s, in whatever drawer or folder or box it uses for fieldwork materials, from the Aba Tibetan and Chang Autonomous Prefecture. The wrong pass still showing clearly on a document that a community decided, a long time ago, was exactly right in its wrongness. Outside the archive, somewhere in western Sichuan, the mountains keep their valley. The spring keeps its direction. The grass moves through the same motion it has always moved through when the wind comes off the peaks in the early afternoon. A slow, continuous lateral motion, the same motion the grass in that valley was making before anyone arrived there with a map, correct or otherwise. The peaks hold the same positions against the sky. They do not know they were drawn incorrectly. They do not know they were drawn at all. They simply remain in the places where they have always been, surrounding the valley in their particular arrangement, indifferent to what any document says about them, letting the spring run between them, letting the afternoon wind move the grass in its long, slow wave, letting the light that comes over the eastern ridge in the morning fall across the valley floor in the same direction it has always fallen, the same warmth, the same angle, the same quality of early morning light that the founding merchant would have seen, sitting beside the spring with the wrong map open on his knee, looking up at what was actually there. On a road in the province of Brabant Wallen, in the very early morning of a day in August 1914, there is a sound of boots on cobblestones getting quieter, not louder, quieter, moving away rather than toward. The rhythm of it, diminishing the way a clock's ticking, diminishes when you carry it into another room, until it is only a suggestion, and then it is nothing at all. The sound of a thing that did not arrive is different from silence. It has a particular quality, a held breath that gradually releases, in the village on either side of that road. Its church, its well, its square of gray stone worn smooth at the center, sits in the morning without knowing what it has been spared, because the soldiers who should have turned here turned somewhere else instead, following a map that sent them in a different direction, along a different road, where different cobblestones recorded a different sound. The German First Army, moving through Belgium in August 1914, was not a single body of men. It was a collection of columns, of divisional formations, each following its own orders, its own routes, and when a march order was misrelayed, when the instruction that should have directed one column through a particular cluster of villages instead sent it along an adjacent road, the villages on that first road simply did not see soldiers. The church remained. The well remained. The square remained. Post-war Belgian municipal records would later confirm what the residents of those bypassed settlements already knew from their own experience, that the casualty rates here were dramatically lower than in comparable villages along the correctly traveled routes, where the consequences of troop passage had been documented with careful administrative precision by Belgian authorities and later examined by historians, including John Horn in his research on the opening weeks of the occupation. A misrelayed order, a column reading the wrong instructions, taking the wrong road, arriving somewhere else entirely. And here, on the road that the boots never quite reached, the quiet of an August morning in 1914 continued without interruption, the light moving across the stone the same way it had moved the morning before, and the morning before that as far back as anyone in that village could remember. The world that did not arrive left no mark. That is the nature of what is preserved. It holds its shape exactly because nothing acted on it. The church does not know it was almost inside the path of a column. The well has no memory of what did not happen beside it. The square continues to be the square, its proportions unchanged, its stone unchanged, the particular way the morning light falls across it unchanged, because the boots went somewhere else, and the history that would have accumulated here accumulated elsewhere instead. There is something in this worth resting with for a moment. The things that endure quietly, without drama, without the visible marks of what they withstood, they endure precisely because they did not have to withstand anything at all. They were simply left alone in the path of an error that moved past them rather than through them, and they continued. A village in the Russian countryside in the winter of 1812 sits inside a cold that is specific and thorough. The temperature in the outer Smolensk region in that winter was the kind of cold that makes sound carry differently, that makes the air feel slightly thicker, that settles into timber walls and stone floors and the haystacks standing in the yards of farmhouses with a weight and a completeness that ordinary cold does not have. The French columns moving through this landscape were following maps. The maps, in some cases, were not entirely right. A quartermaster's miscalculation of march distances, combined with a map error in identifying which rural settlements fell within the designated foraging corridor, caused divisional columns to be routed around a cluster of outer Smolensk settlements in the autumn of 1812. The error was administrative and logistical, the kind of mistake that happens when army supply operations are conducted at speed through a landscape that the maps have not quite captured accurately. Russian imperial administrative records from the period confirm that the settlements the columns missed sustained their agricultural infrastructure through the initial French advance. The grain stores remained full. The haystacks stood untouched in their yards. The families in the farmhouses slept in the same rooms they had always slept in, because the calculation had been wrong in exactly the way that kept the columns away from their doors. In the months that followed, as the Russian counteroffensive built momentum and supply lines became a matter of survival, Russian logistical officers moving through that region found what the error had left behind: full stores, intact infrastructure, communities that had not been stripped of what a moving army requires. The miscalculation that had routed the French away had, in its absence, preserved something that became genuinely useful when the direction of the campaign reversed, a kind of accidental reserve, held in the cold through the long middle months of a winter that was hard on everyone who was not inside a farmhouse with a full grain store and an untouched haystack standing in the yard. The cold of that winter settles into everything it touches, and it holds what it finds without alteration. A haystack in that cold is simply a haystack. It does not know what season it is, or what army is moving through which corridor, or that a mistake on a calculation sheet has placed it on the wrong side of a foraging route. It stands in the yard and holds its shape and waits for the horses that will need it whenever those horses arrive. There are moments in the record of this campaign when the logistics of survival are this quiet, not heroic, not contested, simply present because an error preserved them. The city of Vienna in the early morning of September 13th, 1683, holds a particular quality of light. The sun comes up east of the city, and in September the light at that hour is low and lateral, moving across tiled rooftops at an angle that makes the color of the tiles, their particular range of ochre and gray and rust, visible in a way that the higher light of midday does not achieve. The Danube outside the walls moves in that light the way it always moves, which is to say steadily, between the same banks it has always moved between, in the same direction it has always moved, carrying the same cold water south and east toward the same eventual delta. The city walls are standing. They had been under siege since July. The Ottoman army had been positioned around Vienna for weeks, and the final assault on the walls was understood by the city's defenders to be a matter of days. The timing, in the specific military logic of a siege, mattered enormously. A wall breached before relief arrives is a different outcome from a wall still standing when relief arrives. The difference between these two outcomes is measured not only in military terms, but in the continuation of a city as a city, its streets, its buildings, its population, its particular way of being itself. An Ottoman artillery piece, sometime in the preceding days, had misfired. The powder charge had been miscalculated, or the barrel alignment had been wrong, or some combination of errors in the preparation of the piece had caused it to discharge into one of the Ottoman army's own forward timber bridges, rather than toward the city walls it was positioned to damage. The bridge was destroyed. A critical delay was introduced into the siege's timetable. The relief force under Jan III Sobieski arrived on September 12th and engaged the Ottoman army before the walls were breached. What the morning of September 13th holds, then, is the city still inside itself, the walls still enclosing the streets still running in the directions they have always run, the river outside still moving between its banks, the light coming across the rooftops at that low September angle, finding the color in the tiles, resting there for a moment before it moves on. A misaligned barrel, a miscalculated charge, the bridge going down into the timber and the smoke, the timetable shifting by hours and then by days, and the city continuing to be the city on the morning when it might otherwise not have been. The Danube does not record these things. It moves in the same direction on September 13th that it moved on September 12th and on every morning before it. The walls are simply walls, standing in the light, doing what walls do. The specific September color of the tiled rooftops is a consequence of geology and manufacture and the low angle of autumn sun, and it is present that morning the same way it would have been present regardless, except that someone is there to see it because the city is still standing and the people inside it are still alive to watch the light move across what is theirs. There is no good word for what the misfired artillery piece preserved. Not the city in abstract, the idea of Vienna, the historical significance of the siege. What it preserved is more ordinary than that. The particular streets, the weight of those specific tiled rooftops under the morning light, the river doing exactly what rivers do. In the winter of 1940, somewhere over the east of Scotland, a German reconnaissance aircraft took a photograph. The photograph was analyzed, the grid reference was identified, and what the analysis concluded was that the image showed a strategically significant industrial installation at a location that was in fact a cluster of farm buildings in a small agricultural village near Aberdeen. The error was in the interpretation, or perhaps in the photograph itself, which may have been taken at an angle or in conditions of light that made the farm structures read as something they were not. Luftwaffe target files, examined after the war through documents held in the National Archives, confirm both the targeting of this location and the nature of the error that caused it to be targeted. The bombing runs dispatched to the location struck open farmland and outbuildings. The village sustained no civilian casualties. What that means in practical terms is that the small agricultural community near Aberdeen continued into the winter of 1940 and beyond in the way that small agricultural communities do, with their rhythms largely intact, their households present, their particular domestic world continuing. The error in interpretation spared them. The misidentified photograph, the farm buildings that read as something industrial from above, the wrong conclusion drawn from the wrong reading of an image. These are the mechanism through which the village remained, a village rather than becoming something else. The crater that the bomb left in the open farmland collected rain in the weeks that followed. Rain in the northeast of Scotland in winter is not a dramatic thing. It arrives steadily, without announcement, and it fills whatever low spaces it finds. By spring, the crater held a still pool of water, and above it the clouds moved in the way they always move over that part of the country. Slow, gray, with occasional gaps of pale light that make the standing water go silver for a moment before the gray returns. By summer, the cows had found it. There is something particularly unhurried about a cow at a water source. The movement toward water, the lowering of the head, the slow drinking, these happen at the pace that cows always operate at, which is not quite the pace of anything else, a pace that belongs specifically to the animal and to the particular weight it carries, and to the particular relationship it has with the ground it stands on. The cows of a small farming village near Aberdeen in the summer of 1941 came to a shallow pool of water in a field, and they drank from it, and the pool was there because of a misidentified photograph taken over Scotland in the winter before. The water was the same water, either way. The cows did not know the history of the depression they were drinking from. The clouds went on moving above them, and the pale light came through the gaps, and the village behind the field continued its ordinary business, exactly as it always had. There are places in the historical record where the survival of a community is documented not through dramatic intervention, but through a kind of bureaucratic negative space, the absence of a name on a requisition order, the absence of a column in a damage assessment, the absence of anything at all in the official record, because nothing happened that required official recording. The small farming community in Middle Tennessee in the autumn of 1862 appears in the county records of that period because of what is not there. No requisitioning noted, no property damage assessed, no violence recorded, where the official records of the War of the Rebellion document for comparable settlements along the Union Army's route through Tennessee. The routine consequences of troop passage, the taken horses, the emptied grain stores, the broken fences, the particular taxonomy of loss that follows even friendly soldiers through a civilian landscape. Here there is a gap. A cartographic error depicting a creek tributary caused the column's commander to reroute around what appeared on his map to be a terrain obstacle. The creek in question was in reality not where the map placed it. The obstacle did not exist, or existed in a form that the map had rendered inaccurately. The rerouting took the column away from the farming community through different ground toward different settlements that absorbed the consequences that would otherwise have accumulated here. What that looks like from inside the community itself is just autumn, wood stacked for winter, because winter is coming and the wood needs to be stacked. The ordinary arithmetic of a season's preparation: how much wood, how much grain, how many preserved things in how many jars against how many months of cold. A chimney drawing well, smoke going sideways when the wind comes from a particular direction. A dog asleep in a patch of afternoon sun on a doorstep, its coat warm from the light that has been on it for an hour, its flank rising and falling with the slow rhythm of an animal that has no particular concern about this afternoon, about this doorstep, about this specific quality of autumn warmth. The soldiers are miles away to the west. Their map, corrected after the fact, shows them where the creek actually runs. They are following it now through terrain that is different from this terrain, moving through a different autumn at a different pace. And behind them, the distance between that column and this farming community is growing with every step they take away from it. The dog does not know about the column. The dog knows about the patch of sun and the warmth of the boards under its flank, and the particular quality of the afternoon that surrounds it, which is still and unhurried, and carrying the smell of wood smoke and dry leaves, and the cold that is coming, but has not arrived yet. The dog knows these things in the way that dogs know them, not as information, but as the whole texture of the present moment, which is complete and sufficient and requires nothing further. The wood smoke drifts above the chimney and goes sideways in the slow wind. The autumn light moves across the boards of the doorstep, following its angle, following the particular path that the sun takes across this longitude in October, and it finds the dog's coat and rests there, the brown and the gold of it, the specific warmth of a color that holds light rather than reflecting it. The column moves west. The map is corrected. The community continues. There is a quality that runs through all of these moments, through the quieting sound of boots on a Belgian road, through a haystack standing untouched in a Russian winter, through the walls of Vienna in the morning light, through a pool of rainwater in a Scottish field, through a dog asleep in Tennessee autumn sun. That is not quite luck, and not quite grace, and not quite anything that has a clean name. It is the quality of the world continuing in its ordinary way, through the specific gap that an error opened. The error is incidental. The continuation is the thing. A miscalculated powder charge, a misread map, a misrelayed order, a misidentified photograph, a creek placed slightly wrong on a survey. These are not remarkable things in themselves. They are the kind of mistakes that happen whenever human beings work quickly through imperfect information, which is nearly always. What is particular about the ones that have been preserved in municipal records and campaign histories and archived target files is not that they happened, but that they happened at exactly the moment and in exactly the direction that left something intact. The intact things are not aware of their own intactness. The Vienna rooftops do not hold the memory of the morning of September 13th differently from any other morning. The farm buildings near Aberdeen that were photographed and misidentified as industrial installations do not carry that history in their timber and stone. The Belgian church at the edge of the village, whose square the boots never reached, has no particular record of August 1914 in its walls. These places simply continued, and the continuation is the whole of it, and the continuation is what is visible now in the county records and the municipal surveys and the preserved target files, the specific evidence of something that did not happen. The world is full of these negative shapes. Most of them are not recorded. Most of the times that a column turned the wrong way and spared a community, the sparing was never connected to the turning because the community simply continued its life and had no particular reason to investigate why it had been left alone. The records that survive are the ones where someone later looked carefully enough at two adjacent columns of data, damage rates on this route and damage rates on the other, and found the discrepancy large enough to prompt inquiry. Most of the time, the inquiry never happened. Most of the time, the gap is just a gap, and the community behind it just continued, and no one wrote it down. That is, in its own way, a larger number than the documented cases suggest. The documented cases are the ones where the evidence survived, and someone looked. Behind them, in the uncounted and unrecorded ordinariness of communities that simply remained communities, there is a much wider field of moments in which an error made space for something to continue that might otherwise not have. The dog on the doorstep, the cows at the edge of the crater pond, the haystacks standing in the Russian winter cold, the specific quality of morning light on Vienna's tiled rooftops on September 13th, 1683, which is not different from the light on any other morning, and which is present because a wall still stands that would otherwise have been breached, and which falls on the city the same way the Danube moves beside it, steadily, completely, in exactly the direction that rivers and light have always moved. There is a patience in the way these things persisted. The Brabant Wallon village in 1914 that sat on its road while the boots moved away did not wait for anything. It simply was what it was, and the morning continued, and the road held the fading sound of a column choosing a different direction, and then it held only the morning itself, the light, the stone, the particular gray of an August sky in Belgium, which is the gray of all the other August mornings it had ever held and will hold in all the ones that follow. The grain stores of the outer Smolensk settlements in 1812 held what they held. The cold outside held its temperature. The families inside their farmhouses held their ordinary arrangements. The positions of things in the rooms, the routines of the day, the small practical continuities of daily life in a cold season. These things held not because anyone defended them, but because the error that would have disrupted them went somewhere else, along a different calculation, through a different corridor on a different map. What the error left behind was just the ordinary life of ordinary places, which is what they had been before, and what they continued to be after, and the continuity is the whole of it. The pool in the Scottish field catches the clouds in its surface. The cows that come to it in summer lower their heavy heads and drink. The water is shallow and cold, and tastes of the mineral quality of northeast Scottish soil, and the cows do not have particular opinions about it beyond the fact of it that it is here, and they are thirsty, and the field around them is the field they have always been in. The village behind the field is doing what villages do in summer. The light comes in at the angles that summer light comes in. The grass in the field moves when the wind moves it, and when the wind stops, the grass is still. And this is true of the grass in all the fields in that district, the ones with craters in them and the ones without. And it is true in the same way and to the same degree. The light on the pool's surface changes as the clouds move. Silver when the pale light comes through, then gray again, then silver, slow and regular, following the pace of the sky above it. On the Tennessee doorstep, the afternoon is moving toward late afternoon, the way afternoons do, the sun's angle dropping, the shadows lengthening across the boards, the warmth in the dog's coat still present, but beginning to carry the edge of the coming evening. The wood smoke from the chimney is a thin, straight line now in the air above the house, because the wind has settled, and the smoke goes straight up until it spreads and disappears. The dog's flank rises and falls. This is the breath of an animal in no particular state of alertness, the slow, complete breath of something that has found a warm surface and a still afternoon and has settled into them entirely, without reservation, without any expectation of interruption, because the afternoon on this doorstep, on this particular day in October 1862, is exactly what it appears to be. The column is miles away. The distance is real and growing. Each step that the soldiers take west is a step further from this doorstep, from this dog, from this chimney, and this smoke, and this particular patch of afternoon light on these particular boards. The error that sent them in a different direction is already behind them, incorporated into the corrected map, noted and adjusted and moved past, and what it left here is simply the continuation of what was here before they were anywhere near it. The wood that has been stacked for winter will last through winter,